Hello and welcome to my review of the Sig Sauer Whiskey4 4 to 16 by 44 rifle scope. Overall, it's a pretty nice scope. I'm actually pleased with it. The overall finish and the feel of the scope doesn't feel cheap. It has a nice weight to it, and all the controls from the side focus to the turrets to the rear drafter have a nice finish and a nice feel to them. So to keep some sort of order on this, we're going to go from the rear to the front, starting with this rear speed focus. So from the start, I will take it out here to the end. It's got a continuous tension on it. It doesn't get loose or feel gritty all the way from the beginning to from the bottom to the top, and there is no real perceivable movement or wiggle in that at all. And for me, it's right about there for my eyesight. Moving forward from there, we see the branding, the name of the scope, and then we get to our zoom ring. It has 4 on the 9 o'clock side to 16 just past 3 o'clock, and about a 180-degree throw, which is assisted by this short throw lever, throw stud, whatever you want to call it, which is threaded in. And unlike some other scopes that I've seen that are threaded in studs, this one actually has a fairly thick, or I should say fairly large diameter threading. I'd like to see maybe half again as much actual depth of thread, but once it's threaded in, it does feel solid. It doesn't feel like it's going to break off. If you caught that on something, you're going to be all right. I wouldn't be too worried about snapping that off unless you really banged it on something hard, in which case you might get to take advantage of the warranty on this and have Sig replace it for you. Moving forward from there, we're going to start with the windage turret, which is capped, which is my preference for most scopes, is to just have a capped turret. It is marked left and right for rotation. It is also resettable to 0 and has quarter MOA adjustments. Put that back on there. We'll come back to look at that in more detail when we look at the turrets specifically. The elevation turret, also quarter MOA. It is a lift to unlock. And underneath the turret, if you take this screw out, there is a zero stop mechanism in there, which I will show in more detail when we get to the turret inspection. And then on the far side from the windage turret, we have our parallax adjustment. It goes from a low of 50. Yeah, you can see that. And then has a pretty large sweep between the 50 and 100 mark. And then we see 150, 200, and 300 before we get to the last bit of rotation between 300 and 1,000. Everything tightens up. So if you were trying to do a fine adjustment somewhere like between 600 and 700, you're going to have to probably play with that a little bit to get it right. But it will focus in, and I do find that these markings are accurate to the real world, so that is always a benefit. We're going to see some of that depth of field and whatnot when we go and do the actual outdoors, looking through the glass at targets. Put this back to 100 yards. From there, we go forward. We got 30 millimeter tube up here to our 44 millimeter bell housing on the front objective. It's got just a little bit of styling, but overall the finish is not a complete flat, or excuse me, matte finish. It's got a little bit of glossiness to it, but it is consistent. It's not too reflective. It's, you know, just a nice anodized black finish. The scope comes in this box. It comes with the key for the zero stop system underneath there. It does come with these flip open caps. For the front objective, that one's actually on there reasonably tight. It doesn't seem to want to move much. You can get it to spin, but it's pretty well seated on there. Caps, when open, do fold basically flat to the rear. I wish there was just a little bit more spring tension to hold that down so it didn't want to jiggle around. Just a minor gripe. And then on the rear, we have the same sort of cap. And for me, because of the distance that I have to bring this out for my eyesight, I find that the cap really has very little engagement on the bell, which can allow this to bump and rotate your rear diopter, which would mess with your settings on that if you had it set for your eyesight. My solution for that will be, if I did choose to use these caps all the time, will just be to run a piece of tape around here, some grip tape, to keep this from being able to slide off and to keep it from rotating. But it's nice that they include that in the box instead of just like a set of cheap bikini covers or something like that. For those of you who like the stats, this scope has the total length of 13 3/4 inches and a weight of 22.6 ounces without these caps on it. So the size and weight are comparable to other scopes of this magnification range. It's not particularly heavy, but it's not the lightest scope out there either. But overall, the weight feels about right for the size of the scope. And what else do we need to know about? Perhaps Sig Sauer does have a lifetime unlimited warranty on these. You'd have to go read the details on that. Given that this is the non-illuminated version, I think you'd be covered for pretty much any damage you could do. Sig's warranty for illuminated optics, red dots, and electro scopes it's not quite as unlimited as they tend to make it sound, but you'll have to go to their website and read those details. This scope does come in an illuminated version. It usually runs for about $420 to $450, whereas this unilluminated version sits around the $300 mark, depending on your sale. And that's the basic scope. What do we got down here? It says designed by Sig in Oregon, assembled in China. So if that's an issue, if you don't want something made in China, then this may not be the scope for you. But with that, I'm going to move on to taking a look at our reticle. Here we have the Whiskey4 4-16 by 44 with the Hunter MOA milling reticle, starting at 16x, and we will go down through the power range. We have 12, 9, 6, and then 4 at the bottom. Crosshair becomes pretty fine. Wouldn't be much good in situations where you don't have high contrast targets. It'd be pretty tough to make out those lines. When you get back up to 6, the reticle really becomes more useful as far as being able to see the individual MOA hash marks. When you get to 9, 12, then at 16 you can make out the fine center dot and the individual 1 minute hash marks, as well as the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 going out to 20. Those are 2 MOA for the large hash marks. This is the non-illuminated version. There is an illuminated version. And overall, it is a simple but useful reticle. It's not cluttered, and it has enough information that you shouldn't get lost on the reticle if you're trying to shoot quickly. Now we're going to take a look at the elevation turret on our Whiskey4 4-16. As you can see, it is a lift to unlock type turret. I'm going to be quiet here for a second and let you just listen to the sound of it. So as you can see that there is a hard zero stop, and I'll take the cap off in a minute and show that mechanism to you. But the individual clicks are a little bit lacking in sharpness. You can definitely feel them and you can hear them, but they're not the most crisp turrets you're going to find. They do have a little bit of play in the cap. I think that has to do mostly with the lifting and unlocking mechanism. It just allows for a little play. But when it does roll over the next click, you can tell. And when you go to lock it down, it is pretty close to the individual mark. When we come back here to the back side of the die, you can see it is off just by maybe like a quarter of a click, which in the real world is going to mean almost nothing as far as adjustment. But when we come back all the way around to full rotation and to zero, we see that our turret lines up again. So it's just probably more of an issue with the actual marking on the turret as opposed to the individual clicks mechanically. We'll bring that around to zero, hit our stop, lock it down, and then we will be able to remove our turret. This small screw, set that out of the way for a second, and then that allows us to lift the turret off and expose our zero stop mechanism, which I have already set, but I will undo so that I can show you the ring itself. And it simply uses 3 set screws spaced out around the ring. If I could get the right Allen wrench, that would help. It is, oh, I have it down here. It uses a 50 thousandths Allen key. So if you lose your Allen, the one that comes in the box, it is the 0.050 inch Allen if you needed to go buy a new one, which these typically come in most sets of Allen wrenches. If you have a full set, you probably already have one. So you unloosen that. 2, there's one more back here. And then this ring simply lifts off. You don't want to lift this ring off, you want to keep that one in there. That has a stop of its own that has to line up. And then on the ring, it says, if I can get that to focus, there we go. To set 0, rotate, loosen 3 screws, and rotate. So that literally just has the instructions right there on the ring. Pretty simple. There is a stud right there that sits in a groove. And when the rings are not tight, or when the set screws are not tight, it just rotates freely along with the turret, or the turret rotates freely inside of there. But once you've set your 3 set screws, it will engage this inner tower, and as it goes around, it will hit the mechanical stop. It works nicely. It's very simple, pretty hard to mess up. I wouldn't crank on it really hard. Coming back to 0, you could potentially damage that small stud in there, but as long as you're not ham-fisting your turret, you should be okay. Let me slip this back on, and then we will move on to the windage turret. There we go, put that on there. Start our screw, get out trusty old Abe. tighten that down. The one nice piece about the locking is that it can't rotate while you're loosening that screw to reset your zero. So that's nice. All right, so those are the operations of our elevation turret. Now you see I can go past the zero because I have disconnected the zero stop ring from the tower of the turret, and so it allows me to dial past zero. All right, on we go. Okay, here we have our uncapped windage turret. It is nicely marked for left and right rotation so that you know which way to turn when you go to make your adjustments. It is resettable for 0 and uses a 3/32 Allen key. There's a little screw on the side here that you would loosen up, lift this key, or lift the cap off. And it's a pretty small screw, so be careful with that. It'd be easy to lose. And then this just slips off. Set it to back to your indicated mark here at 0. It lines up right there. And then put your screw in, tighten it back down. Now on this one, because it is not a locking turret, you want to keep your fingers on this thing just so as you're tightening it, it won't spin one notch. Don't over torque that. That's a pretty fine thread going into some brass in there, and you don't want to strip that out because that will essentially ruin that turret. So just go easy on it when you're torquing it down. You're going to have your cap back on there anyway, so it will be protected against rotation that way. So let's go ahead and have a listen to these turrets like we did the other one. These turrets actually feel better, or the windage turret feels better than the elevation turret. I think that's largely because it doesn't have the extra mechanisms in there for the zero stop and the lift to unlock. They have a nice audible click, a nice tactile click, and there is substantially less play in that turret, as you can see there. So I really like that turret. I wish it was made out of, well, you know, that might be made out of an anodized aluminum. First I thought it might be plastic, but it has very nicely knurled splines up here that really allow you to get a purchase on there. Even if you had gloves on, you wouldn't have any trouble grabbing that thing and giving it a spin. But it is the sort of turret that you're going to set it, potentially reset your zero, and then put your cap on it to keep it protected and prevent any inadvertent changes in your windage. It's a good turret. I like it. I think that's about all there is to say about it, though, and we will move on. All right, now we're going to look at a prepared target of mine that I'm going to use sort of as a eye chart for these scopes. We're currently at 50 yards, which is the minimum parallax adjustment for this scope. In the future, if I have some that go lower, then we will go closer. But being as this is the lowest magnification that, or the lowest parallax setting for this scope, there's really not a reason to try to go any closer since it will not adjust low enough. Right there, we're at 12 power. You have to forgive a little bit of the shaking. We're working with a little bit of wind out here today, which is not helping my tripod remain steady. Fortunately, what we do have is plenty of sunlight, so we can make out all the detail on there that we really want to, each individual card, and the lines and the color chart, and even the individual lines in the yellow on our bullseyes. It's a very clean image. I'm just going to sit here and let y'all take a look at it for a minute before we will reset and move out to 100 yards and take a look at that too. Alright, I have moved us back to 100 yards, and we can see our target there. We are currently at 4 power. You can also see my majestic Honda Pilot. So let's zoom up through about 10 power. Right there. Starting to bring in some details on that board. Now we're at 12 power. This is where the fine center dot of this particular reticle, which Sig refers to as the Hunter 2 MOA, 2.0 MOA, I think is what they call it. You'd have no trouble establishing a very precise zero with that fine center dot. I've adjusted our point of aim ever so slightly just so we don't obscure any of that target we don't need to. But we can still make out most of the detail on those individual playing cards. We can still see the lines in the bullseyes, as well as have nice color representation between the blue, the red, and the yellow. Our color chart there next to the playing cards is also pretty good. Maybe the yellow down there at the bottom of that is somewhat washed out against the white of the paper itself. But we can also make out quite a bit of detail on that Christmas card and the individual ornaments. Alright, I have a setup here now to look at our 300 yard area rules, and I have a starting out at 4 power magnification. You have a nice wide field of view. See much of the detail on that Ford pickup truck and its boat trailer. On the other side of that levee is a boat ramp to get into the Missouri River. So let's go up through our power range. We have 10 power, and we're starting to be able to pick up much more detail on those individual signs. Not quite legible. And as we get to 12 power, we see that the image looks very nice. We have quite a bit of detail in the grass underneath, and some of the words on those signs are able to be read. The pieces of paper on the brown backing are a little bit too much in the shade to make out much detail on, but you can tell that there are multiple pages of information there. And then finally we get to 16 power, and we can read those individual signs posted on the crossbar, and then the individual pages in the shadows on the brown backer are still too low contrast, too low resolution to really pick up the information on them, but we can tell that there are individual pages. Our depth of field between our white pages there and the trees in the background, there's actually 2 rows of trees. There's one right at the top of the berm, and then there are trees on the opposite side of the river. The ones at the top of the berm are, no, not with the light they were. They actually aren't that good of a view. Perhaps if the sun were more directly overhead, we'd be able to make those out a little bit better. But as it is, if there was someone walking or if there was a target sitting up there, you would definitely be able to tell them from the trees, but we don't have a tremendous amount of clarity on those trees at the moment. All right, I think that'll do. This first tower that we see right in front of us is at 340 yards. Let me go ahead and zoom this in. We're currently sitting at 4 power. Nice field of view. We'll get up here to about 10, and I'll stop for a second. you can see there at 10 power, everything's starting to sharpen up. We can see much of the detail on the transformers. We can see much of the brickwork. There is the cables going back and forth across the image from the different lines, and the cables going from the tower itself back to the power pole. If you look closely up on the left side around the 10 o'clock, you can see the silver antenna sticking off the top of the building, and there's very little chromatic aberration. We'll see if it stays that way as we go to the top of the magnification. Right there's 12. And now we have 16. Brighten that image up just a little bit so we can see some more detail on the brickwork of that building and the shadows. With the naked eye, it's much more apparent when you. So let me pan just a little bit to the left, and we'll look at the handrails going up to the pump house. And what is important to take notice of is the clarity of those handrails, where we can see much of the bolts and hardware holding those steps together. But then also, if you notice the tree, the short bush just behind the rails, let me move over here a little bit, that is actually at about 450 yards. So with the parallax set to about 350, we have a depth of field that actually goes much beyond that. Just try to give us a good look here. Okay, so we have this power pole where we can see that little box down there towards the bottom of the post. That is at 225 yards. The stairs for the pump house are at 350 yards, and the bush behind it is at 550 yards. My bad, it was not 450, it is 550. So even at 16 power, if you were looking at any of those things, you would not need to make an adjustment to your parallax. You would still have a useful image. So let me back this back to about 10 power. And you can see that everything from that 220 out to that 550 yards, all of that is in focus. Even those little birds flying through our image. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is going to be at 650 yards. I'm going to zoom us out to 4 power just so we can enjoy the field of view. So there we go. I'll just pivot here to the right. And these individual power poles continue out all the way to this one right here in the middle. That is at 650 yards. They continue on past that until we get to our next pump house. So that is at 650 yards. And we are currently sitting at about 6 power. I'm going to dial this up to 10, which is about right there. We're already starting to see quite a bit of detail on that. Start to make out the bricks, individual bricks. We can see some contrast or some detail in the grass there around the base of the house, and we're starting to be able to pick up some of the details on that transformer and power pole. And as we get up here to 16, now we're able to make out much more detail. Again, we see our antenna up there on top of the building. I'll just dial this, moves just a little bit here. And as we get just a little bit more sunlight, we can really see just how nicely that image looks. Still got that chromatic aberration where the sun is shining off of the transformers. But as far as the building itself and the stairs and the grass, and even the trees in the distance, way in the background, that berm is at, I don't know if my rangefinder will grab it, but we're going to try. That berm back there is at 1,365 yards. So if you were using this, even with our parallax set for the 650 yards that building is at, you would still be able to observe anything beyond that without having to do any changes to this parallax on the scope. And the reticle has enough detail or fineness to it that taking shots at smaller targets, 8-10 inch plates, would be no trouble at all at this distance. Scan back across, we'll see our 330 yard pump house right here. I'm not going to stop on that white one just because the sun is washing it out pretty badly and it's behind that bush. But you can see the continued power lines that continue to go out from our 650 yard building. They take a left turn and then they follow a gravel road out to our 880 yard pump. And now, just for reference, that tree line in the back is at about 950 to 975 yards, depending on if you go from the right to the left. So let me get this set here where I want it. All right, so starting at 4 power, we're going to zoom up. Going past 9 to about 10 right there. Starting to pick up a lot more detail. And those crops there in the front by the power pole and where those birds just flew out of is at about 225 yards. Again, our building out there is at 880. There we are at 12 power. And finally 16 power. Now we've lost focus on that 220 yard power pole, but that's to be expected when we set our parallax out to 800. The depth of field, not quite that good. And as the sun comes out, we're going to see a little bit of chromatic aberration on those transformers, as has been consistent. I'll just turn us here now to left just a little bit and settle on our post, or our power pump house. Again, we can still see that antenna sticking out of the top. We don't quite make out the little individual tines of the receiver, but we can still see the main post. Still make out quite a bit of detail on our stairs and on our handrails. There is some more chromatic aberration showing on those as they're getting hit with the sun pretty good right now. And even in the background, we can make out a fair bit of detail in the tree line. It'd be helpful if the grass right in front of us wasn't causing a blur in the image. Maybe just see that fuzzy movement in the bottom right, or the bottom half of the objective. That's for some grass at about 30 yards. Okay. Take one more look at our power transformers here. You can see that yellow cable protector down there near the ground as it comes up. And as the sun comes out, we're going to pick up a little more detail in those trees behind it. And we'll see, we can just make out the lines going off to the right from the pole. They're a little tougher to see going off the left to the actual pump house. They're just lost in the similar coloration of the trees behind it. But overall, we have a very nice image. We have a very useful image even out to distances at 880 yards. I wish I had something further to look at, but that is the furthest distance that we can make out for one of these water pumps down here in our conservation area. I'm just going to back this out, and then we will call it a day, I think. Here we are back on the desktop with our Sig Sauer Whiskey4 4-16. I am going to try to give you my final thoughts quickly because this review is already going to be about 40 minutes long. And the big question is this scope worth the $399 that it commonly retails for? And ultimately, that's a question that can only be answered by you. If you appreciate the features that this has with the locking turrets and the zero stop and the image quality that we saw out in the field, I would say it very well could be. I didn't happen to pay anywhere near full retail. I only paid about $200 for this scope. So for me, it is absolutely a winner. I think if you could find this on sale closer to like $350 or maybe even less, then I would say that it is definitely worth that money, given just how nice the image was through the scope and the basic set of features that it incorporates. I think for a hunting scope, something you might put on like a 308 or a 6.5 Creedmoor that you would want to shoot out to potentially 500 yards, I think it would serve you extremely well. The drawback being that it has a fairly simple reticle for those people who might be more interested in like a PRS type setup, something where you're going to be wanting to make quick follow-up shots based on some sort of Christmas tree or mill grid type reticle. This obviously doesn't have that. It's a very simple MOA hash mark reticle that if you have the time to lift your cap, dial in your dope, that has very precise 1 MOA windage holds that will make the task of compensating for wind very simple. So overall, I think this scope is a good scope. I don't know that I would personally feel like it was worth my money for $400, but if you like the lower turrets, for target turrets, those actually aren't very tall, and the whole thing is maintaining a pretty thin, slim profile for a 4-16. And the weight is also not the lightest you can find in this power, but at 22 ounces or almost 23 ounces, it's not bad. Like, it's much lighter than some other scopes in this power range that are, reaching up there towards the 30-ounce mark. They're almost a half a pound heavier than this scope. So you will definitely not be adding as much weight to your gun if you were going to use this for a hunting rifle. And that's really about all I have to say about it. I think it's a good scope for a hunting rifle. That's about all there is to say. As far as those of you watching, if you've stuck around this long, I appreciate that, and I hope that you will hit that like button and also drop me a comment. Let me know if you agree with what I've said in this video or if you have some different opinions. I would love to hear those thoughts. And with that, I think I will finish up this review and send you on your way.